Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear students, today we are going to start with chapter number 2, Sources of Corporate Finance. In this chapter, we are going to see in detail what are the sources of owned capital and what are the sources of borrowed capital. In today's lecture, I'm going to brief you up with sources of owned capital. Now, before starting with the chapter, let's see what role finance plays in an organization. Now, as you all can see, finance plays a very important role in production, marketing, and customer services. These all activities are very important in an organization. Now, no business activity in an organization can be followed or can be pursued without financial support. Finance is necessary throughout the activities of promotion, organization, and regular operations. All the activities held in an organization is ultimately dependent upon finance. Now, as you all know, the finance needed by an organization is termed as capital, right? The money invested in a business is known as capital. A joint stock company, a big organization, requires a huge capital for, its all undertaking and its all activities. This huge capital collection of capital, or I can say capital formation, has a special significance in the management of joint stock company. Capital formation, what is capital formation? It's nothing but a process of collection of capital from various sources according to the financial plan of a company. Now, various sources, what are the various sources? As we have seen in the previous lecture, owned capital or borrowed capital. This is what it's explained here. A joint stock company collects huge funds through different sources. Now let's see what are these different sources. Owned capital, borrowed capital. But as I have told you in the starting, we are going to study each and every in detail. Now, coming to the owned capital, you have got two, shares and retained earnings. In shares, again, it's divided into two, equity shares and preference shares. In borrowed capital, you have got two, debentures, public deposits, bonds, ADR and GDR, that is American Depository Receipt and Global Depository Receipt. You have got bank, financial institutions, and trade credit. Now, sources of finance may be external or may be internal. Now, what are the external sources? When capital is raised from the outsiders, from out of the company, from the external sources. And then you have got internal sources. When capital is made available from within the organization. This we are going to see in the coming lectures. Now, sources of owned capital. The capital raised by company with the help of owners, or I can say with the help of shareholders, is called owned capital or ownership capital. Now, why am I saying it as owners or shareholders capital? Let's see. Now, when the shareholders, when a general public or a general people, when they try to buy the company shares, they become the shareholders of the company. Now see here, when a person invests money, that is when a person supplies capital to the organization, and in return that organization or that company gives share certificate, company shares to the person. The moment this deal takes place, that moment only that person becomes the shareholder of a company. So I can say after buying shares of the company, the person becomes shareholder of the company, and when the person becomes shareholders of the company, the person becomes the owner of the company. That's the only reason the capital invested in the form of shares is known as or termed as owned capital or ownership capital. Shareholders capital, owned capital or ownership capital. This is the one form of raising capital through owned sources, that is companies owned capital. Another form of owned capital is retained earnings. Retained earnings in detail we have seen in the previous lecture. We are just going to brief it up today. Again, retained earnings is nothing but plowing back of profit. What is plowing back of profit? The plowing back of profit is keeping aside, or I can say reinvesting certain amount of profit into the business again, right? It is, see, retained earnings, it is also known as plowing back of profit. Secondly, it is an internal source of finance. Why am I calling it as internal source of finance? Just because the profits you have earned this year, you are going to keep a certain portion aside. The profit company has earned in the second year, again, a certain amount company is going to keep aside. Likewise, the company is going to accumulate profits. Its company is going to keep aside profits of the, year, all the years, first year, second year and third year. And maybe in the fourth year, the company is going to use this accumulated profit, or I can say company is going to reinvest the same amount into the business. That's the only reason we call it as internal source of financing. Now, the money which company has kept aside, the company reinvests this profit in the business in the form of, maybe you can say, buying new plant and machinery, or, buying new land, equipment, or doing R&D. We have seen why R&D is so important in an organization, right? To expand the company, to introduce a new product in the market, R&D is very important. That is research and development. And yes, for that research and development, again, finance or the capital is needed at every step. So that's the reason you can say retained earning is an internal source of financing, and it is also owned, it is the owned capital of the company. Now, see here why we are focusing it as every time owned capital of the company, just because after, when the company gives dividend, after distributing the dividends, after paying the debts of the company, the amount which is kept aside is the money of shareholders only. So that's the reason it is known as owned capital, shareholders capital, or I can say it as retained earnings. Now, there are a few important points which I'm going to highlight in the coming slides. So, you have to keep in mind all these important points. Owned capital is regarded as permanent capital. Owned capital is regarded as permanent capital as it is returned only at the time of winding up of the company. Once the company has generated money through shares, the company is going to pay this amount back only at the time of winding up of the company. That is when the company is closed or when the company is getting liquidated. It's the permanent capital. See now, once the shares are issued, the company invests this money permanently in the company. Now, owned capital in the form of share capital provides initial source of capital for a company, that is at the time when the company is getting started. Now, when a promoter, now who gets an idea to start a company? A promoter, right? So when the promoter gets an idea to start a company, when all the promoters, they come together, they make a financial plan. How much amount it's required to build a company. At that time, they try to bifurcate how much amount they are going to require as owned capital and how much amount they are going to require as a borrowed capital. So can I say this owned capital is an initial source of capital at the start. This share, when the company forms, that moment the company issues shares to the public to generate funds, to raise funds. So that's the reason it is said that owned capital is an initial source of capital. But again, a company can raise any time later to satisfy additional capital needs of the company. Let's say I want to start a company. I raised my capital as an initial source by issuing shares. Okay. Now after 5 years or after 7 years, I need some more money to expand my business, to grow my company, okay, to diversify. So again, at that time, I can issue few more shares in the market. So that's the reason I can say it as it can be raised any time later to satisfy additional capital needs of the companies. Owned capital can be raised again in the further year when company wants to expand. Now, on the other hand, retained earnings cannot be an initial source of capital. Now see, why am I telling is it cannot be an initial source? Because see here, now coming to the retained earnings. What are retained earnings? Retained profits. Now see, the most important and significant source of finance for an established profitable business. To become profitable, to maintain goodwill, it takes a lot of years. So that's the only reason it is said retained earnings are not an initial source. Why? Because it will take certain time for a company to grow. Let's say for the first year, what if the company doesn't make profit? If there is no profit, no portion would be kept aside as in retained earnings. Okay? It takes 2 to 3 years for a company to settle down, to establish, to prosper and to grow and to become a good profitable business. When a company establishes and become a profitable business, at that time only company keeps aside certain money as in retained earnings. And after collecting, 2 to 3 years profit, a huge amount as in retained earnings, company then invests the same into the business. It can be an important source of capital when company runs its business profitably during its existence. That means after 2 years or after 3 years. Now see, again the last point of today's lecture is who is a promoter? And what is a role of a promoter? As we have already seen who are promoters in 11th standard. Promoters are the persons, or I can say an individual or the persons who comes up with an idea to start a business. So now once a person being a promoter comes up with an idea, so it's but obvious that the person is going to make certain financial plans. The person is going to decide from where he or she is going to raise capital, to raise finance, and in what forms. So can I say promoters decide the share capital required by a company? At the initial stage, who is going to manage the company? Of course, the promoters of the company. So yes, promoters decide the share capital required by a company. Now, the amount of share capital, this amount of share capital is known as authorized capital. Now, what do you mean by authorized capital? The word authorize means approval or permit. So can I say authorized capital is maximum amount a company can issue shares. Let's take an example. Suppose to start a company, I have taken an approval. I have taken an approval of 10 crore rupees to start a company. But at the initial years, I only require 5 crore rupees. So now I'm going to issue shares of 5 crores only. But then I have got the authority, or I have got the approval to raise 10 crore rupees. So can I say I can raise additional capital after a few years when I require some more investment in the company, right? So the amount of share capital is also known as authorized capital, that is maximum amount a company can issue shares. Now this capital clause is stated in the Memorandum of Association. You all remember there are two most important documents of the company: Memorandum of Association and Articles of Association. At the time of incorporation, the company has to submit these two documents to the registrar of companies. So yes, the capital clause. First you have got name clause, and the second most important clause you have got is the capital clause. So yes, this authorized capital is mentioned in the capital clause of Memorandum of Association of the company. Now, a short assignment is here, and I hope you all are doing with the assignments, and that's all for today. Thank you.